I've been talking to Mr. Barton, and we think that we could get a lot of work done if we limit the debate, and we'll allow 10 minutes on each side, but I would encourage people to take even less time. So this will put people on notice that we'll probably move through and get a bunch of votes, so don't go too far away. Mr. Barton?
I have agreed to that with one proviso. There may be a few amendments that require slightly more time, but in general, I think that's a fair way to do business for the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much. We're now recognizing members who have amendments to Title III, and I look to the Republican side of the aisle.
Mr. Chairman, over here in the broom closet behind the kids'
Mr.
table.
Burgess, way over there. I'll see Mr. Burgess. I want to recognize you. Do you have an amendment?
Yes, amendment is Burgess 029XML. I took a picture of it with my iPhone and the clock in the background yesterday, but I didn't have the date stamped on it.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I'd like to recognize the gentleman to speak on his amendment for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. The manager's amendment, the amendment in the nature of a substitute before us, ensures a price for carbon credits and a market for trading those carbon credits. Now, these may be the ingredients for a very interesting recipe in creating Wall Street's newest, hottest exotic financial instrument. We're all aware that if something has a price, the wizards on Wall Street will find a way to derive new and fascinating financial instruments to option, hedge, and swap, and create fees for trading these new instruments that derive their value from the price of the underlying asset. If you don't think this can happen, we don't have to think too far back to remember Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, AIG, and what about the currency manipulation by George Soros? The current financial crisis has heightened our awareness of the use of financial derivatives like mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps and the effect they have on the value of the tangible asset in the marketplace. This committee, a year ago, held hearings on dark markets and the off-market commodity trading on the Intercontinental Exchange. We can ill afford to set up this type of system without adequate protections in place. Mr. Chairman, the best medicine is preventive medicine, not after the fact radical surgery, the type of radical surgery that we've seen in our financial markets this past year. Now, Thomas Friedman, writing in the New York Times on April 8, 2009, in an op-ed column, stated that Americans will be willing to pay a tax, but they are much less likely to support a firm in London trading offsets from an electric bill in Boston with a derivatives firm in New York in order to help fund an aluminum smelter in Beijing, which is what cap and trade is all about. People won't support what they can't explain, end quote. Mr. Chairman, this amendment very simply prohibits the transfer or receipt of carbon credit derivatives. It is a simple amendment. It is preventive medicine at its best, and I urge members to support its passage, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair would like to now recognize Mr. Stupak.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As most of you know, for the last 3 years, I've worked in this area trying to regulate these markets, and I think the Burgess amendment is well intended. However, when I take a look at it, and actually this legislation, because of work I've done with the chairman and Mr. Markey and others, we have the Pump Act, the act I've worked on for the last 3 years, prevent the unfair manipulation of prices, is in this legislation. And not just to oil and gas and energy, but also to the carbon assurance market that we have set up in this legislation. And my only concern with the Burgess's amendment, it would completely ban the trading of carbon allowance futures and other derivatives. And I think this could be a bad idea. The most important reason for trading in these futures is to give regulated entities some certainty about future costs. We've heard so much about costs and anticipation. In the regulatory scheme that is in this legislation that we've put in the last few days, we're giving the entities some certainty about what their costs will be. If a regulated utility knows it will need carbon credits or carbon allowances a decade from now. It can lock in those allowances at a specific price and not have to worry about unexpected changes in price. Derivatives trading isn't about helping out Wall Street. It's really about reducing the market unpredictability and really helping the utilities and the affected industries here to plan to gain some certainty so they'll be more easily able to plan and budget for future. I'm also concerned that the amendment would do nothing to prevent trading of carbon derivatives on foreign markets by overseas agents, as we see with ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange, which is all traded here but closes in London, and CFTC says we have no control over that. We change all that in this legislation. The most aggressive, most comprehensive regulation of these markets, the dark markets, the exchanges, is now found in this legislation that we've been able to put in. So I'm very concerned that the foreign market loophole would continue underneath the Burgess Amendment. The Waxman-Markey bill, as written, will tightly control and effectively regulate carbon allowance derivatives. This amendment would drive these trades to the Burgess Amendment, I believe, would drive these trades to unregulated markets overseas. The net effect of Mr. Burgess' amendment, and Mike's been on the Oversight Committee with me for some time. I know it's well intended. I just think would actually increase the risk of fraud and market manipulation. So at this point in time, I would urge my colleagues not to support this amendment. I will be offering an amendment next, granting a cease and desist order, because one of the problems we see in this area, even though we find speculation, we find increased prices, we find market manipulation, FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, has no authority to say stop and freeze the assets. So that will be the next amendment we got following up, just to even tighten the Waxman-Markey bill even tighter. So all this area we've worked on for the last couple of years on market regulation, manipulation, speculators in the market, we have a very tightly controlled in this bill, and we actually closed the foreign loophole. We do away with most of the derivatives. So our bill is much more comprehensive than what Mr. Burgess is trying to do. Again,
Would the
good
gentleman
intention.
yield?
I just think it doesn't go far enough, and I'd ask
yield?
for a no vote, and I'd yield to Mr. Markey.
There's no question derivatives must be regulated. They weren't regulated, largely. The language which the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, after his 3 years of working on this issue, here and in other areas to make sure that there is very strong regulation, is central to ensuring not just that this market, but that any market can work. And Mr. Stupak has been the leader in Congress over the last 3 years and insisting that that be the case. And the language here is as tight a set of regulations as has ever been imposed on derivatives. And I just wanted to thank Mr. Stupak for all of his work.
Well, will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Will the gentleman yield for a question? Mr. Stupak, perhaps we could shed some light on this. We'll just ask a question of counsel as to whether or not, now I presume you're talking about subtitle E on page 702 and 703 in the amendment, the nature of a substitute, is that correct?
It's part of it, yes. It's found throughout the bill.
Could we ask counsel if that subtitle that has been added to the amendment, if that prohibits trading in speculation in the derivatives market? It's subtitle E begins on page 701. Could I ask that question of counsel?
Counsel, respond.
Regulated allowance derivatives are addressed in both subtitle D and subtitle E. Subtitle D includes several provisions related to regulated allowance derivatives, including default rules. You'll see on page 695, paragraph 4B, all contracts for the purchase or sale of any regulated allowance derivative shall be executed on or through a board of trade designated as a contract market under the Commodity Exchange Act.
May I further ask, does this cover the price of carbon credits?
Could you clarify your question?
No, could you clarify your answer?
This provision here essentially is a default rule against over-the-counter trading of regulated allowance derivatives.
But does this prohibit trading on the price of carbon derivatives?
It does not prohibit trading of derivatives.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, that therein is the problem. The Commodities Futures Trading Commission, as we heard in testimony in our subcommittee a year ago in this very room, refused to take any action when they saw, when the whole world could see that there was a problem. All I'm saying is, let's not wait for those conditions to exist again, bubble up and boil over. Let's prevent it at the source. This market doesn't need liquidity. I don't really know what a ton of carbon dioxide looks like. I doubt that anyone would ever actually take receipt of a ton of carbon dioxide. But the fact of the matter remains, you're going to have a lot of people playing in this market who really do not have an ownership stake in that carbon dioxide, and as a consequence are only doing it for the financial aspect. We saw where that led us last summer. It's a dangerous road. We shouldn't go down it with this cap and trade legislation.
I think we've had a good debate. Now let's proceed to a vote. Mr. Rogers,
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would stipulate that Council actually agreed with me that subtitle B, D, and E do not prohibit the trading of the carbon derivatives.
well, the gentleman is correct. It does not prohibit the trading, but it does limit it very severely, and with the penalties that are in the bill, I believe Mr. Stupak would argue that we have made sure that we've learned the lessons, and we're going to prohibit these abuses.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, you cannot make a rule that some clever criminal will not run rings around this committee, and I'll yield back.
Okay. Mr. Rogers, how much time do you want? 2 minutes, and then we're going to go to a vote. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the opportunity to stop the vultures who are flying around this issue right now. People who came in front of this committee to testify and say what a great bill this is will make billions of dollars off of average Americans struggling to pay their light bills. That's what will happen, even if you get it right. And as a former FBI guy, I'll tell you, we won't get it exactly right. There will be somebody who scams this system, because there is never any time you can take delivery of anything. This is a scam. And when you get people who probably wrote big chunks of this bill, who will go out and make as much money as they will by taking it away from honest, good old-fashioned Americans who are trying to make it, it's just dead wrong. This is the only way we can guarantee that those families are not going to get ripped off by a system where Wall Street and derivatives are going to help them improve the environment.
Well, gentlemen, yield.
I don't have much time, but yes, I'll yield.
But look at the legislation. We've put in the rules of the Pump Act of 2009. We banned naked credit default swaps. We include only bona fide hedging. We have an advisory committee with the CFTC that tells you and sets energy limit positions, including carbon. We included a CFTC inspector general. We eliminate the swaps loophole. We exclude FERC from financial transactions rights for
with my 30 seconds,
changes.
and I appreciate the gentleman's point that the gentleman's point. He's tried to put in any protections.
We didn't try.
It's
in the bill.
But this is the real difference here. You're either going to side with the people who are trying to pay these electric bills, or you're going to side with Wall Street.
No,
You
for the
have to
first time
decide.
ever,
No.
we're going to regulate Wall Street, which
Gentlemen,
they are not
my
doing
time.
right now under
No, you're
the
not
legislation.
regulating a market. You're selling something that doesn't exist in order to influence a market that you can't see and you can't take delivery of.
That's why we.
That's why
Mr.
Europe had
Stupak,
that's why Europe had fraud problems with this. You can't control it. It's wrong to do it this way. There's a much better way to get a control on carbon, and it won't cost jobs, and it won't be the single largest energy tax in the history of the United States. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Those in favor of the amendment, please raise your hand. What is it the gentleman, speak in your mic. What would you like? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'll ask for the yeas and nays on this, please.
You asked for the yeas and nays, so we'll proceed to a roll call vote.
Mr. Waxman? No. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingell? Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Gett votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadegg. Mr. Shadegg votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 22, the nays were 35.
22 ayes, 35 noes. The amendment's not agreed to.